So, hi, welcome to Bible 101. I'm your host, Al Hudgins. This is session number 9. And let me see, let me push this little display off of my screen. There we go. This session is called The Bible House. And it works a domestic metaphor, asking what are the rooms, quote unquote, in the Bible in which you like to hang out, if you do. Or maybe you don't feel at home anywhere in the Bible. That's okay too. But as you think about that idea, I'd like to take a quick tour through the Bible at different dwellings and houses in the Bible, just to kind of get us primed for this metaphor. Passages about living spaces or dwellings. First of all, does anybody who's here have any idea, any thoughts come to your mind about rooms or houses in the Bible that stick out in your mind, if any? And it's okay if none do. But before I go through my little list, I was going to see what you all might remember.
Al, what do you mean by houses in the Bible exactly?
Well, like where somebody lived, somebody's house. It could be a tent, it could be a brick and mortar, it could be any number of things. So just basically, are there any scenes in the Bible that are domestic scenes that come to your mind? That's what I'm asking. Yeah, go ahead, Jane.
Mary and Martha, at the home where Mary and Martha are, one of them is greeting everybody and the other is cooking.
Right. That's a great one. Yeah. Anybody else?
When I was in seminary, we spent a lot of time, because the Old Testament is so long, we focused a lot on the Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar stories. That's whole cycle. And so there's all these sort of tent-related moments, including Sarah listening outside, like listening to Abraham talk with the angels, the angelic messengers who tell Abraham that they're going to have a baby. So, there's a lot of sort of imagined domestic scenes in that series and cycle.
That's great. And I purposefully avoided tents because there were so many. So I'm glad you mentioned that. That kind of covers us on the tent front. Okay. Anybody else? All right. So I'm going to just, if you have your Bibles, if you want to follow through, I have my Bible marked with all these little pieces of paper. So I'm going to read the things, but if you want to know where they were, if you want to jot them down, that's up to you. The first structure that I was going to talk about very briefly, all these are going to be brief, is in Genesis chapter 11, Genesis 11, 1-9. This is where you find the story of the Tower of Babel. Does anybody remember the story of the Tower of Babel?
Yes.
Okay, what do you remember? This is Genesis 11, 1-9.
11. Well, the end result of everybody speaking different languages. I guess they don't remember enough about the tower, though.
Well, it does say in chapter, in verse 3, they said to one another, let's make some bricks and we're going to burn them thoroughly. Yep. And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. And then they said, let's build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let's make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we'll be scattered abroad across the whole face of the earth. Now, I'm not going to get into further than that, but that's a structure early on in the story. It's not a tent. It's actually a brick and mortar, literally, that they're trying to build this tower up to heaven. And the name Babel, Bab-El, as I understand it from my notes, means gate of God. Gate of God. So they're kind of basically giving him a conduit from heaven down to earth. People have tended to think of Babel in the sense of the word B-A-B-B-L-E because they began to babble amongst each other because they started speaking different languages. But that's not what Bab-El means. Although in the text itself, they talk about confusion. There's a Hebrew word Balal, B-A-L-A-L, which means confusion. And so the writer merged those two, Bab-El and Balal, to mean the gate of God that's confusing. Okay, that's all I'm going to do with that. Now we're going to go to Joshua chapter 2. Joshua chapter 2. Joshua is after the Moses stuff, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Then there's Joshua. Joshua chapter 2, verse 15, just verse 15. This is about a different kind of a house, one that I always found intriguing. This is about Rahab. Now, Joshua sent spies into the city of Jericho to see what was going on before he attacked it, and they stayed with Rahab. And she mentioned not only in the Old Testament, but the New Testament. But anyway, in this verse 15, it says that she let them down. They stayed overnight, and she kind of misdirected the authorities so they couldn't find them, hid them up on her roof, and then she let them out through a rope down through the window, because her house, it says in verse 15, her house was on the outer side of the city wall, and she resided within the wall itself. Now, I kind of think that's kind of cool to live inside a wall. I don't know, there's something about that that sort of intrigued me. So that's all I'm doing with that one. That's another unusual place to live. Now we're going to go to Judges chapter 6. Judges chapter 6, verse Judges, that's right after Joshua. And the verse here is, wait a minute, I don't have, 19, 6:19. We're going to go into Gideon's kitchen. Now, Gideon is a character from that book, as is Samson and Deborah and several others. And this is, we're going to hear a little bit about how apparently Gideon has had a way with cooking. And this is what he does in verse 19. He went into his house and prepared a kid, a goat, and unleavened cakes from an ephah, I don't know, how do you say that, Beth? Ephah of flour, whatever.
Sounds good to me.
The meat, yeah, basket to you, very good. The meat, well, we got basket coming too. The meat he put in a basket, and the broth he put in a pot. And he brought all of that to him under this oak that he was meeting and presented it. So again, just a tiny little slice of domestic life for Gideon, which I didn't even know was in there until I came across it. Now we're going to go to a more familiar story in the book of 1 Samuel. That's quite a few more pages down. We're pretty much working our way through the Bible here. 1 Samuel chapter 3. 1 Samuel chapter 3. Now this one you probably may have heard before. I'm sure it's in the lectionary somewhere. Oh, yeah. Now the boy Samuel, this is verse 1. The boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord under Eli. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. At that time, Eli, whose eyesight had begun to grow dim so he couldn't see, was lying down in his room. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called, Samuel, Samuel, and he said, here I am, and ran to Eli and said, here I am, for you called me. But he said, I didn't call you, lie down again. So he went and lay down. The Lord called again, Samuel. He got up, went to Eli and said, here I am, for you called me. But he said, I didn't call my son, lie down again. Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. The Lord called Samuel again a third time, and he got up, went to Eli, said, here I am, for you called me. He didn't have a lot of variety in his dialogue, does he? And then Eli perceived that the Lord was calling the boy. Therefore, Eli said to Samuel, go lie down, and if he calls you, you shall say, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. So Samuel went down and lay in his place. And then it goes on into this thing that the Lord wanted him to tell Eli, which was complicated and not pertinent to the story that we're dealing with. What was interesting to me about this was where Samuel was staying. Well, what does it say about the room that Samuel was in? What was in the room that Samuel was in? Maybe it zipped right past you. So this is in verse 3. Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was, the same ark of the covenant that's in Raiders of the Lost Ark. So he had a roommate. He was roommates with the Ark of the Covenant, and he was staying in the temple. That's where this little boy was staying. Kind of unusual. So a different way, another different place to live. That's all we're doing with that. Let's now go to 2 Samuel chapter 7. 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 1 to 13.
Hold on.
Yeah, take your time. 2 Samuel 7, 1 to 13.
Okay.
So when the king was settled in his house and the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies, the king said to the prophet Nathan, now, see now, this is God speaking to Nathan. See now, I am living, David speaking to Nathan. See now, I am living in a house of cedar, but the ark of God, that same one that we were just talking about, stays in a tent. Nathan said to the king, "Go, do all that you have in mind, for the Lord is with you." But that same night, the word of the Lord came to Nathan, "Go and tell my servant David, thus says the Lord, are you the one to build me a house to live in? I have not lived in a house since the day I brought up the people of Israel from Egypt to this day, but I've been moving about in a tent and a tabernacle. Whenever I have moved about among all the people of Israel, did I ever speak a word with any of the tribal leaders whom I commanded to shepherd my people? I do not build me a house of cedar. Now therefore, thus you shall say to my servant David, thus says the Lord, from the past," this is him talking to David, because remember, David was a shepherd, "from following the sheep to be prince over my people Israel. And I have been with you wherever you went, and have cut off all your enemies from before you, make you great names, like great ones of the earth. And I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them so that they may live in their own place, and be disturbed no more. And evildoers shall afflict over my people. I will give you rest from your enemies." Let's see how I go with this. That might be enough. Nope, not quite. "So moreover, the Lord declares to you that the Lord will make you a house. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down to your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come forth from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish a throne of his kingdom, the throne of his kingdom forever." So lots of stuff about houses in that passage. The ark is staying in the tent, and back in the story with Eli and Samuel, it was in the temple. But these were temporary structures, right? And then, but what they wanted to do was to build a really beautiful building, like the palace that David lived in, which was made of cedar and a whole bunch of other good stuff. And so God is saying, well, it's not going to be you. Who was it that built this temple to God after David? Does anybody know? Besides the obvious priest in the room?
I do.
Oh, go ahead. No, we're blanking on everybody else, so go ahead and tell us.
His son Solomon.
Solomon, right?
I was
So
gonna
you've heard of
say-
Solomon's temple.
I was, but I no, I
Solomon's temple.
honestly thought I was
I believe-
wrong.
Oh no, you were right.
Yep.
You could
So-
have cut that baby in half.
So this is a story, again, the Bible occasionally drifts into stuff about structures and houses and dwelling places. And God was in a tent, but David wanted to put him in a temple. And God says, all in good time, your son will do it. Don't sweat it. In one of the other books, I think in Chronicles, perhaps, it talks about the reason God didn't want David to do it, but let's not get distracted. Let's move again now to, speaking of Solomon, let's go to 1 Kings. That's after the Samuel books. 1 Kings chapter 3. Another story you may have heard before. Chapter 3, 16 to 28. 1 Kings 3, 16 to 28. Later, two women who were prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. The one woman said, "Please, my lord, this woman and I live in the same house."
There you go.
Then on the third day, let's see, "and I gave birth while she was in the house. Then on the third day after I gave birth, this woman also gave birth. We were together. There was no one else with us in the house. Only the two of us were in the house. Then this woman's son died in the night because she lay on him. She got up in the middle of the night and took my son from beside me while your servant slept. She laid him at her breast and laid her dead son at my breast. When I rose in the morning to nurse my son, I saw that he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning, clearly it was not the son I had born. But the other woman said, 'No, the living son is mine and the dead son is yours.' The first said, 'No, the dead son is yours and the living son is mine.' So they argued before the king." There's a lot of really interesting details in this account that I didn't know, I didn't remember. I just remembered the basic story. So it's interesting. I didn't know what they did for a living, for example. Anyway, the king says, this is Solomon now. The one says, this is my son that's alive and your son is dead. While the other says, "Not so, your son is dead and my son's the living one." So the king said, "Bring me a sword." And they brought a sword before the king. And the king said, "Divide the living boy into two, then give half to the one and half to the other." But the woman whose son was alive said to the king, because compassion for her son burned within her. Please, my lord, give her the living boy. Certainly do not kill him. The other said, it's neither mine nor yours. Go ahead and divide it. Then the king responded, give the first woman the living boy. Do not kill him. She is his mother. All Israel heard of this judgment that the king had rendered, and they stood in awe of the king because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to execute justice. So a different and unusual story of domestic life, these two women living together, both of them pregnant at the same time, within 3 months of each other giving birth, and then arguing over the two-child because the one woman sat on her baby and killed it. A very strange but interesting story. Now let's go to 1 Kings chapter 7, just a few pages later. Chapter 7, verses 1 to 14. Speaking of another palace here. Solomon was building his own house 13 years, and he finished his entire house. He built the house of the forest of Lebanon. He built the house of the forest of the Lebanon, 100 cubits long. They're saying that these had pillars that were like being in the forest. The pillars were like trees, what the note said. 30 cubits high, built on 4 rows of cedar pillars with cedar beams on the pillars, roofed with cedar on the 45 rafters, 15 each row, which were on the pillars. There were window frames in the 3 rows, facing each other in the 3 rows. All the doorways and doorposts had 4-sided frames, opposite facing each other in the 3 rows, and so forth and so forth. It goes on and on. Cedar and all things like that. So it wasn't that everybody in the Old Testament lived in tents, okay? So some of the places in the Old Testament even required a kind of architect, certainly knowledgeable builders to create a structure that is as complicated as this suggests. Okay, let's go to a different house now. This is going to be in 1 Kings chapter 17. So a few more pages down. Wait a minute, let's see. Wait a minute, do I have that right? Yeah, 1 Kings chapter 17. I don't have a piece of paper for this one. So I'm wondering if I did that right. Let's find out. Chapter 17, verses 8. Okay, yeah. 1 Kings 17, verse 8. Verse 8. Chapter 17, verse 8. Then the word of the Lord came to him. This is Elijah, the prophet, saying, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and live there. For I've commanded a widow there to feed you. So he sent out and went to Zarephath. And when he came to the gate of the town, the widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and said, bring me a little water in a vessel so I could drink. As she was going to bring it, he called to her and said, bring me a morsel of bread in your hand. But she said, as the Lord lives, I have nothing baked, only a handful of meal in a jar, a little oil in a jug, and I'm now gathering a couple of sticks so I may go home and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die. I don't know whether she's talking about how bad a cook she was, but anyway, that's what she said. Elijah said, don't be afraid, you've said, but first make me a little cake of it and bring it to me, and afterwards make something for yourself and your son. For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, the jar of meal will be empty, the jug of oil will not fail until the day of the Lord's, because there's been a famine, I forgot to say, until the Lord brings rain on the earth. Let me see, how far am I going with it? 24. Okay. So she did as Elijah said, so that she, as well as he and her household, ate for many days. The jar of meal was not empty, neither did the jug of oil fail, not according to the word of the Lord that he spoke to Elijah. After this, the son of the woman, the mistress of the house, became ill. His illness was so severe there was no breath left in him. She then said to Elijah, what have you against me, O man of God? You've come to me to bring my sin to remembrance and to cause the death of my son. But he said to her, give me your son. He took him from her bosom, carried him into the upper chamber where he was lodging, and laid him on his own bed. He cried out to the Lord, O Lord my God, have you brought calamity even upon the widow with whom I'm staying by killing her son? Then he stretched himself upon the child 3 times and cried out to the Lord, O Lord my God, let this child's life come into him again. The Lord listened to the voice of Elijah. The life of the child came into him again, and he revived. Elijah took the child, brought him down from the upper chamber into the house, and gave him to his mother, and said, see, your son is alive. So the woman said to Elijah, now I know that you're a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth. So not every miracle that happened in the Bible happened outside in public, in a big public square and so forth and so on. This was a miracle in a domestic setting, a house. Just another domestic image. Okay, now we're going to go to a different room. This is in 2 Kings. 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 8. 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 8. One day, Elisha, this is not Elijah, this is the other guy whose name is almost like Elijah. Elisha, who came after, was passing through Shunem, where a wealthy woman lived, who urged him to have a meal. So whenever he passed that way, he'd stop there for a meal. She said to her husband, "Look, I'm sure that this man who regularly passes our way is a holy man of God. Let's make a small roof chamber with walls and put there for him a bed, a table, a chair, and a lamp, so that he can stay there whenever he comes to us." Let's see, I think that's all I'm doing there. Yep, so here's another example of domestic accommodations. This is where Elisha stayed when he passed by this particular town. This wealthy woman had the resources to make that happen. Hang on a second. Do you need any help? You got it? Okay. Let's keep going. Now we're going to Psalm 84. Psalm 84. Verse 1, starting with verse 1. 84.
Got it.
Oh, I love Psalm.
How lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord of hosts. My soul longs, indeed it faints, for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh sing for joy to the living God. Even the sparrow finds a home, and the swallow a nest for herself. To reach the wall there, Pop. Pop, there's a walker right there if you need help getting up. Hang on a second. You got it? Okay. All right. Let's see here. Where did I stop? My soul longs, indeed it faints, for the courts of the Lord. For my heart and my flesh sing for joy to the living God. Even the sparrow finds a home, and the swallow a nest for herself, where she may lay her young at your altars, O Lord of hosts, my King and my God. Happy are those who live in your house, ever singing your praise. Hang on a second. Oh, yeah, hang on a second. That's okay.
I love this psalm. The image of the sparrow and the swallow and like making their nests in the altar, like the bees we have in the wall who've returned.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like this past week I walked in and heard them.
Oh,
and
really?
Looked up and saw them.
That's never a good feeling. All right, let me continue. We're going to skip from verse 4. Let me see. No, we did the sparrow, the nest. Happy are those who live in your house, like Samuel, ever singing your praise. Now we're going to jump to verse 10. For a day in your courts is better than 1,000 elsewhere. I would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my Lord than live in the tents of wickedness. For the Lord is a sun and a what's that? Somebody was saying something. I didn't catch it.
We're just finding our spot.
No. Oh, okay. Yeah, this is still the same psalm. We're in verse 10. I would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than live in the tents of wickedness. For the Lord is a sun and shield. He bestows favor and honor. No good thing does the Lord withhold from those who walk uprightly. O Lord of hosts, happy is everyone who trusts in you. So this is a psalm about God's house and how good and comfortable this particular writer feels when he goes there. Okay, let's go now to Proverbs chapter 7. Proverbs is right after the Psalms. Proverbs chapter 7, verse 6. Now this is a different kind of house and not a very nice house, as it turns out. Oh, there's two houses. This is a story about two houses in the same town on the same evening. The writer of the proverb is saying on verse 6, for at the window of my house I looked out through my lattice, and I saw among the simple ones, I observed among the youths a young man without sense, passing along the street near her corner, her being this woman we're getting ready to meet again, taking the road to her house in the twilight, in the evening, at the time of night and darkness. Then a woman comes out towards him decked out like a prostitute, wily of heart. She's loud and wayward. Her feet don't stay at home. Now in the street, now in the squares, at every corner, she lies in wait. She seizes him and kisses him. And with impudent face, she says to him, I had to offer sacrifices, and today I've paid my vows. So now I've come out to meet you, to seek you eagerly, and found you. I have decked my couch with coverings, colored spreads of Egyptian linen. I have perfumed my bed with myrrh, aloes, and cinnamon. Come, let's take our fill of love until morning. Let's delight ourselves with love, for my husband is not at home. Okay, so that's a very different kind of house, but there it is. Let's keep reading. He took a bag, let's see, with much seductive speech. This is verse 21. She persuades him, and her smooth talk compels him. Right away, he follows her and goes like an ox to the slaughter, or bound like a stag towards the trap, until an arrow pierces its entrails. He's like a bird rushing into a snare, not knowing it will cost him his life. So a very different kind of house of ill repute, I guess you might say. Now let's go to Song of Solomon. Song of Solomon, chapter 1. This is just one little piece, one little verse.
Hold on.
Song of Solomon is right after Ecclesiastes, which is right after Proverbs. So you just flip a few more pages.
Okay.
Chapter 1, verse 17. The beams of our house are cedar, our rafters are pine. I like that line because I can just imagine that house, how pretty it must be.
Hmm.
Now, there's a whole lot of other stuff in the Song of Solomon we're going to skip over. But
The last verse.
In mine, it says the beams of our houses are of cedar, our rafters of cypress trees.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay.
Wow.
Wow, that's
An
good.
alternative.
Yeah.
Huh. All right, now we're going to go to the book of Isaiah. We're almost finished with this survey. Isaiah chapter 6, verses 1 to 8. Chapter 6 of Isaiah. We got to get past, let's see here, Psalms and Song of all that other stuff. We're into the prophets now. 6. This is another fairly familiar scene. It's another domestic image, but a different one because it's a vision. In the year that King Uzziah died, Isaiah is talking, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high, lofty, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs were in attendance above him. Each had 6 wings. With 2 they covered their faces. With 2 they covered their feet. They flew. And one called to the other and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. The pivots on the thresholds shook at the voices of those who called, and the house filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me, I'm lost, for I'm a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. Yet my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphs flew to me, holding a live coal that had been taken from the altar with a pair of tongs. He touched my mouth with it and said, Now that this has touched your lips, your guilt has departed and your sin is blotted out. And I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And I said, Here am I, send me. So again, he's having this vision, but it's a domestic image of this realm, this heavenly realm. It's got details. It has domestic details. All right, still with me?
Yeah.
That's often read at ordinations. It's like one of the options for ordination reading.
Yeah. No, it's an oldie but a goodie, right?
Yeah.
All right, Daniel now. We're going to talk about Daniel's house, the prophet Daniel. After Jeremiah, after Lamentations, after Ezekiel, there comes Daniel.
What chapter?
It's the 6th chapter.
Bring.
Verse 10. Daniel 6:10. Now the king had issued a proclamation that said nobody can pray to anything else but me. They got to pray to me, nobody else. And if you don't follow this, you're gonna be thrown in jail. Although Daniel knew that the document about this law had been signed, Daniel continued to go to his house, which had windows in its upper room open towards Jerusalem, and to get down on his knees 3 times a day to pray to his God and praise him, just as he had done previously. The conspirators, let's see, is that all I want for that? No. The conspirators came and found Daniel praying and seeking mercy before his God. Then they approached the king and said concerning the interdict, King, did you not sign an interdict that anyone who prays to anyone, divine or human, within 30 days except for you, to you, O king, shall be thrown into a den of lions? The king answered, the thing stands fast according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked. Then they responded, Daniel, one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you or to the interdict you've signed. He's saying his prayers 3 times a day. Then the king heard the change. He was very much distressed. He was determined to save Daniel. Until the sun went down, he made every effort to rescue him. Then the conspirators came and said, you know, you can't change the law. That's essentially what they said. So he gave the command, and Daniel was brought down and thrown into the den of lions. And the king said, may your God, whom you faithfully serve, deliver you. All of this problem with the, Daniel in the lion's den came from being what Daniel did in the privacy of his own house. Okay. Now we're going to go to the New Testament, Matthew chapter 6.
All right.
Matthew chapter 6, verse, 19 to 21. This is about making sure that you don't care too much about your house. Do not store for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust consume and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust consumes, and where thieves don't break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Now we're going to go to the Gospel of John, chapter 2, I think it is. Let's see. Chapter 2, verse 1. The wedding at Cana. Gospel of John, chapter 2, verse 1. On the 3rd day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee. The mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, his mother said, they have no wine. And Jesus said, woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour hasn't come yet. His mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you. Now, standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said, fill them with water, and they filled them to the brim. He said to them, now draw some out and take it to the chief steward. So they did. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine, he did not know where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. The steward called the bridegroom and said, everyone serves the good wine first, then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you've kept the good wine until now. Jesus did this, the first of his signs in Cana of Galilee, revealing his glory, and his disciples believed in him. So again, not just living in tents and hardly, listening on, this is a fairly sophisticated occasion, right? So, we don't always think about where the people in the Bible are living, right? That's what I'm trying to do with this. Okay, let's go now to John chapter 3, very next chapter. Verse 1. Now there was a Pharisee named Nicodemus, leader of the Jews. He came to Jesus by night, said to him, Rabbi, we know you're a teacher who's come from God. No one can do these signs that you do apart from the presence of God. Jesus said to him, very truly, I tell you, no one can see the kingdom of God without being born from above. And they continued to discuss. But where did this conversation take place?
Well, I don't know.
What did you say? I didn't catch what you said.
I said, I don't know. Where did it?
Verse 2. He came to Jesus by night. So he went to Jesus' house, wherever that was. He went to where Jesus was staying. And he had this very complicated and intellectual conversation, theological conversation in the middle of the night. He did that in part because he didn't want anybody to see him going to Jesus' house. So he did it, under the cover of darkness. But the conversation, and it's an extraordinary conversation, it's where the Great Commission is and a whole bunch of other good stuff. All of that happened in Jesus's house in a domestic setting, in the privacy of a house. We don't always think about that. Sometimes we think that all these conversations in the Bible happen almost in front of pulpits or something, that they're very formal and fancy and so forth. But this was a midnight conversation, in Jesus's house, and they were hanging out on his sofa, so to speak. Okay, here we go. Just a few more. This one is a really interesting has an architectural fixation. This is in Matthew chapter 17.
Matthew. Hold on.
Matthew, got to go back now, backwards, 17, 1-8. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John, led them up to the high mountain and by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun. His clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah, the first of the two guys with the similar names, talking with him. Then Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it's good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings here. One for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. So Peter had architectural delusions of grandeur here. I don't know how he thought he was going to manage that in one little, but anyway, that's what he wants to do. He wants to build houses for these 3 people. While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud said a voice, "This is my son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up, don't be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one else except Jesus himself alone. But Peter's instinct was, let's build them houses. We're going to build a theological condo here, right? It was a very interesting response to the situation. But again, Jesus changed, and God, God's voice changes everything. They're filled with fear at the sound of the voice of God, and all of a sudden, all this idea about building houses goes completely away.
Yeah, that's what I thought was my daughter.
I can't hear what you're saying, but that's okay. All right. And then let's get to John chapter 12. John 12. This is the one somebody mentioned before. We'll just touch on it briefly. John chapter 12, John 12, 1-3. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, the home of Lazarus, whom he'd raised from the dead. There they gave him a dinner. Martha served. Lazarus was one of those at the table with him. Mary took a pound of costly perfume made of pure nard and anointed Jesus' feet and wiped them with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of her perfume. So, yes, one of you mentioned this was a really enduring domestic image. Okay. And then lastly, from the Gospels, Luke 22:8, chapter 8, Luke 22.
Wait a minute. Okay.
And the verse 8, 22:8, Luke. Jesus sent Peter and John. They'd just come into Jerusalem, and it was the feast of the day of the unleavened bread. He says, "Go prepare the Passover meal for us that we may eat it." They asked him, "Where do you want us to make preparations for it?" "Listen," he said, "when you've entered the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him into the house he enters and say to the owner of the house, 'The teacher asks you, where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' He will show you a large room upstairs, already furnished." So they went and found everything as he told them and prepared the Passover meal. We've heard many times about the upper room. This is the upper room. It's a very complicated way in which they procured the upper room. There's several people involved. Look for the guy carrying the water, then let him take you to the owner, and then check with the owner. And I don't know how Jesus knew that, but that's another story for another time. Let's see. Oh, Mark. Oh, yes, I didn't. One more gospel. This is in Mark chapter 2. Verse 1-5. Jesus returned to Capernaum. This has been bugging me for some time. It's not Capernaum, it's Capernaum. Go look it up online where that guy from Israel will tell you how to pronounce it. Capernaum, not Capernaum. Okay. When he returned to Capernaum after some days, it was reported that he was at home. So many gathered around that there was no longer room for them, not even in the front of the door. And he was speaking the word to them. Then some people came bringing a paralyzed man, and he was carried by the 4 of them. And when they could not bring him to Jesus because of the crowd, they removed the roof above him.
The week before or something.
What's that?
One of our stained glass windows depicts this.
Oh, okay. And they let down the mat on which the paralytic lay. When he saw their faith, he said, "Son, your sins are forgiven." So again, really interesting domestic image. They're having a house party. There's a big turnout. The only way they can get this guy down in front of Jesus is to take the roof apart and drop him down, which I think was very clever on their part. Okay, now we're going to go to Acts and then John, and we'll be done with all of this. Acts chapter 2, 44-47. Chapter 2, 44-47. Acts chapter 2. This is about the church after the early church and how they lived. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. Day by day, they spent much time together in the temple. They broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having the goodwill of all the people. Day by day, the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. And then right nearby, chapter 4, verse 32 to 35. Now the whole group of those who believed were of one heart and soul. No one claimed private ownership of any possessions, but everything they owned was held in common. With great power, the apostles gave their testimony to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all. There was not a needy person among them, for as many as owned lands or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of what was sold. They laid it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to each as any had need. Now there's another in chapter 10. I'm not going to read it because it's too long, but if you have a chance to read it yourself, the whole chapter 10 of Acts talks about Cornelius, who wanted to reach out to Jesus. He had a specific request. Meanwhile, Jesus is staying at this house of a guy who had a house by the water. He says, let's see. This is chapter 10 of Acts, verse 6. He's lodging with Simon, a tanner whose house is by the seaside. I love that image. Meanwhile, Peter goes up on the roof for the midday siesta and has this vision where he's really hungry and this food is brought down, but it's all food that the Mosaic law prohibits, bat, owl, and stuff like that. And he doesn't want to eat any of that because it's not kosher, so to speak. And so but God says, what does God say? He says, whatever I have said is okay, essentially. And then he's ready to talk to Cornelius, because Cornelius is a Gentile, and this is going to be the opening of the gospel to the Gentile. So that whole chapter is really interesting, and it's rooted in the domestic metaphor of this house where Peter is staying. Okay, now, that whole series of things just helps you kind of get a little more homey with the Bible in a little bit of a way, right? But here's what but I want to talk now about places in your life where you have felt at home. Besides your obvious home that you grew up in, perhaps, but maybe some other place that you've also felt at home. Anybody want to share about that?
I think sometimes churches, like if you have a connection with a church community that meets in a certain space, it doesn't have to be a church. It could be like a regular meeting space. Or I participated in a small group at my home church, and it was held in a couple's home. And so it became, if you have a positive association with that space, when you enter it, you feel at home.
Yes.
So there's a lot to be said for hospitality, and then, I feel like you feel it bodily. You feel that like your whole body feels like you're at home when you have a routine like that with a space that you feel welcome and comfortable.
Yeah, that's good. I was in a small group when I was in my 20s. I was running a group that was reaching out to other people in their 20s and also high school students. And we would meet every week in different houses. And we thought we needed to do that because we wanted to really reach out to people who weren't going to church and would be off put by going to church. So we had it in a house instead. But we had the same, and then finally one host, and we would rotate from week to week to different places. Finally, one family just agreed to host us every week, and we did the same thing there. We began to have this association with this house. It was a great place to learn about things and to get HDR, heavy, deep, and real. That happened in that house, and it changed the way we felt about that house and about that family.
Oh, that's interesting. So you're saying that like you initially were going to different places,
yes,
but some of having a routine of going to the same place in that homey setting, right, added some depth to the.
Yes.
Oh, great.
Yeah, because we did just like you did. We associated stuff with that particular house. Yeah. And
that's great.
Yeah. Anybody else have a place that they can talk about? Yeah, go ahead, Jane.
I would actually speak for my mom, who lived with me the last 7 years of her life. She grew up in Jersey City, and the church that she would have attended was maybe an old Gothic kind of church. And then when she lived in the Midwest, there were lots of 1960s modern, different stained glass, bright colors, and in Texas also. So when she moved back to live with me in New Jersey again, Our Lady of Sorrows in South Orange was that same old Gothic church. And every time she entered, she felt like she was like in the church of her childhood. She was in that same architectural model. And she had been a very regular attendee at these modern churches. Is not,
Yeah. But there was an association with the architecture.
Yeah.
That happens a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And the other way too, you know, people that were used to the modern, then they have to go to an old a Gothic
Yeah,
one. And
it doesn't appeal.
Right, yeah. Okay, anybody else?
Does it have to be a church?
No?
Oh, so I have two places. My barn,
Yep.
because I've been there, I've been with the same group for 20 years, and we have an interest in horses and everything. But also when we're talking up our horses and stuff, we talk about life, like, you know, people talk about their children, jobs, everything. And it's sort of like, I don't know. Do you remember the show Cheers? Like I always say, that's where everybody knows my name.
Your name. Yeah.
Sure, yeah.
And then a more recent was my sister introduced me to Afro Flow Yoga online. It was a studio in Cambridge, but when the pandemic happened, they went online, and it was great, especially during the height of the pandemic. The teacher she merged the traditions of Africa with yoga, and it was really wonderful. And we talked about, you know, we had discussions afterwards, and we talked about different issues that were impacting us all.
Oh, those are great examples.
I realized my grandparents' houses. I mean, they don't exist anymore because they were torn down in New Jersey on the shore. But any of the family, big family of cousins, you know, if we mentioned something about one of those houses, we could all tell you the furniture, the pictures. We could tell you all the detail.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I was going to do that too. My grandparents, my father's parents, their house had a parlor. People don't really think much about what a parlor is, but the parlor was the place where if the preacher came to visit, you'd take him to the parlor and talk to him. It was a room of formal conversations of you know, there were certain conventions. If you just wanted to hang out and watch TV, you didn't do it in the parlor. You did it in the inn. But the fact that, and so therefore for me as a kid, the parlor was a little off-putting. Because I wasn't very comfortable, you know, because they almost never came to see me in the parlor, right? And so for me, that room was it was in the house, but I didn't do much with it, and I never felt comfortable in the parlor. We're going to double back to that in a minute. The other thing that house had was that in the kitchen was a wood burning stove where they cooked a lot of their stuff, and so, you know, the smell of the wood burning stove. And the way and I was, one of my jobs was to feed wood to it and all that kind of stuff. That was different. I didn't have that in the house in Norfolk where I grew up. And in my other grandparents' house, all of this is in Matthews County where I live now. My grandparents had, first of all, we went there Christmas Eve and had Christmas at the house with my grandparents and their other two children and their children. So all of my first cousins. Right, and my aunts and uncles on that side. That house. So we went upstairs. The kids were all put upstairs, which wasn't heated, and so we had lots of quilts and stuff to stay warm. And we were so excited because it was Christmas Eve, and you know, we were cautioned not to talk to each other and stay up half the night and all that sort of stuff. And then downstairs where the heat was, their house was heated with a floor furnace. I don't know if any of you have ever had an experience with a floor furnace. But there's this almost door-sized grate that's actually sitting on the floor, and underneath of that, all the heat is coming up, and it's usually in the middle of the house, so it can kind of spread out to the far corners. And I never, you know, and of course, if you come in out of the cold, that's the very place you want to stand for a minute.
You betcha.
Yeah, get warmed up. But you know, no other place I went had such a place as that. So that was interesting too. So features of a house that were unusual and things that I felt comfortable with. Because I like the floor furnace. I wanted my time on the floor furnace to get
right.
So okay. So now, having talked about some of these ideas of places where you felt comfortable, let's talk about the Bible as a kind of house, like a large house. What sort of house do you imagine when you think about the Bible, or do you? Or can you now? Oh, I think, Jane, you were saying something, but no, there was no sound.
I don't think of them as grand. I mean, you took us away from the tents by showing us cedar and bricks and things like that.
Yeah.
But because it was so long ago, I think of them as simple.
Okay, that's fair. Anybody else?
the story of the friends helping the man who is paralyzed in through the roof, I found it helpful to learn, that people had these roofs that were not permanent.
Right.
They probably had to keep replacing them, but you would do things on the roof, like maybe you would dry food or things like that. So there was like a ladder or steps to get up to the roof. So it was helpful.
And it was flat.
Yes, it was flat. So it was like helpful, but you could have removed some and brought him in that way. And it was helpful when I learned that to be like, oh, okay, I can see. Because if you're imagining suburban New Jersey house, somebody bringing somebody in through the roof, it sounds more destructive. And yet, but like people would have been accustomed to going up to the flat roofs and that sort of thing. So I think it is helpful to think about what these spaces look like, and that the house wouldn't have been big, but was so crowded they couldn't find another way. So I like the creativity of, working with what they had.
Is the entire Bible house too intimidating to enter?
I think a lot of people feel that way. Maybe there's one passage or one story or one book that feels comfortable, but overall.
Back to that, but is it too much like a building full of parlors, right?
A building full of parlors. Oh, that's an image.
Yes.
Because I think a lot of people do feel really intimidated, and that's one of the reasons people have been coming to the Bible 101, because they just don't know what to do with the daggone book. And they're a little bit intimidated by all the different parts. And every time they randomly look, they wind up in these weird passages where they go, what? There was a really memorable episode of The West Wing in the second season that I happened to watch recently, where the president is being challenged by somebody in terms of his religious faith and the political decision that he had made. And she's quoting from one of the first 5 books of the Bible. I forget the issue. Probably homosexuality or gay rights of some sort, or maybe abortion. I don't know. But anyway, and then Bartlett, the president, rattles off all sorts of really other interesting but arcane things from those same 5 books. He says, my chief of staff continues to want to work on the Sabbath. Where should I have him stoned? Or, rhetoric like that. And so there is an awful lot of stuff in the Bible that is really peculiar and intimidating. You don't know what to do with it. Okay.
I don't think I work a lot with younger people, and I don't think they're even intimidated. They just don't feel it has any relevance in their lives. They feel it's a complete myth. They don't care. I mean, it's like, it's not intimidation. It's like, that has nothing to do with my life. I'm out of here.
It's irrelevant.
It's old. Some old people wrote it, who were racist, prejudiced, and everything. So I just wanted to say, it's not intimidation. It's borderline revulsion at a lot of the ideas.
No, that's great. That's a very good point.
And I think some of it has to do, this ties into the Heart of Christianity book, where and actually the chapter this week is on the Bible. But when Marcus Borg talks about the 2 paradigms, earlier and emerging paradigms, how you approach the Bible plays a really big role. So if you're looking at the Bible literally, versus that's the earlier paradigm, versus the emerging paradigm, looking at it as both historical and metaphorical. And so I do think people can be encouraged, whether or not they're inside the church, and can relate to the idea that all peoples have been telling stories, and within those storytelling methods are ways of conveying truth. Mm-hmm. And people continue to do that, even whether or not it's in an actual storytelling format or written down, to tell stories that make meaning. And that's what's happening in the Bible. And for people who connect with it, God is still speaking through those stories, but there's also things that we critique and say are not relevant. So even in the same, there could be, a passage I love in Colossians talking about, which I think I cited recently, talking about clothing yourselves with love and gentleness and patience. And the next line, the next chapter, the next verse after a section I really enjoy can be talking about the subjugation of women. So, and then even like the passage we had from Jeremiah today that I considered preaching on, which has some lovely language about planting yourself kind of where you are and caring about the welfare where you are. But it's an elite that was brought to Babylon, but they were really oppressed. So it's like a questionable recommendation of, but it's a way of also making meaning and accepting that you're not returning to Jerusalem anytime soon. So, but it was interesting to read some commentaries because some people were like, I know we love some of this language and it may make us feel better in certain contexts, but at the same time, it can be helpful to pay attention to the original context, you know. So it is interesting because I think when people have been only exposed to the Bible as, thank you, as a weapon or a wedge.
Or judgment, it's a way to be judged.
Yeah,
I mean,
of course it's going to be
and
super
of
off-putting.
course, like, I'm at it, you know, it's like, I'm out of
Yeah.
here. I grow up with this. I don't care about this. I mean, and
Yeah.
that's the fastest growing segment of the US population. So
No, that's right.
Also very, very dense. You know, I was a literature major, and I find it's daunting. Just as Beth said, I like the Psalms, but they're more like a poem. And then you go into a dark, long genealogical story with 55 begets. And so it's not something, even I, who, you know, went to school and read Chaucer and Shakespeare and those kinds of even Victorian things, our young people don't read things in the, even certain things like Grapes of Wrath. Some of our young people would find that too dense and too wordy and detailed. So I don't know what.
Well, some people from that generation critique texts where the writer spells out all the words.
Yeah.
Because their understanding of texting is, let's say this with as few characters as we can.
Yeah.
If you write Y-O-U instead of the letter U, you know, they look down on that because it's not efficient.
Well, you know, you don't want to make a Reader's Digest version of the Bible.
No.
But it is true that for many people who do read, getting to go to a Shakespearean play that's just as fraught and dramatic as our lives seems really cool, right? So someone has to do a better job of helping young people link to some of that joy. I mean, some people are never going to be thrilled with a great play or a passage in the Bible, but if introduced well, they could get something out of it, maybe, right?
Well, I think part and parcel of that, what I think Carmen was bringing up from the youth, I think and certainly that's true with my kids, to my chagrin, is a disbelief in God. That's where it starts. And so the Bible is irrelevant because God is irrelevant, because all of it is myth. And so, but someone who has a feeling that there is something like a God that's in there is more drawn to the Bible as a possible way to learn more about this mysterious figure. So part of the problem that some people have with the Bible is the problem they have with the idea of God himself.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, they're just not interested. The other thing I was gonna say is I'm taking a course at Cornell postgraduate right now, and it's on marketing content. But do you know all my assignments have to be posts, like 200 words or less?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
How few words?
200 words or less. Like, I'm writing about, like, right after this, I'm working on like why Wendy's has it is social media, but I'm writing about why Wendy's social media marketing is effective, and they're one. But all my assignments are 200 words or less. I have to write.
Wow.
Oh my gosh. It's like 2 paragraphs.
Yeah, but it has to
that
be
gives me pause.
impactful 2 paragraphs. But here's my point.
Yeah, not wordy.
The world's not changing. It's not going back the other way. So to dream, I mean, I'm just saying it's not effective.
Well, it's also
that's not necessarily true, because the Middle Ages, things got really simplified, but then in the Renaissance they got more complicated again, and they were neoclassicists. They were saying, let's go back to what the Greeks did. We had lost that, now we're going to recover it again. So it is possible.
I don't think it's possible in today's world. I mean, I think it's happened, but I don't think it's likely. And certainly, maybe everybody except Beth's lifetime, it's going shorter and shorter. People, I mean, when you can only read 200-word reports,
Right.
it's just going to get more and more that way. So how do you spread the message in that kind of context?
Well, let me, because I know we're almost out of time. We started a little bit late, but I see that we're at 106 now. Let me throw this out at you as the way I was going to wrap this up, and that may have some relevance to the question you just raised. Just as I like going to my grandparents' house, even though I never cared much for the parlor, I did like going to the house and standing next to the wood stove, or right, or standing over the grate. So there were parts of the house that drew me in, that I felt comfortable in, and there were parts of the house that didn't draw me, and that I didn't feel comfortable in. But it didn't stop going to the house. So I found the parts of the house I'd like to go to, and I went there. And we can do that with the Bible too. So, for example, what my feeling about the Bible in terms of where is the front door for the Bible? I think the front door for the Bible is not necessarily Genesis chapter 1, because it goes off into some really crazy stuff before too long. But there are places I think you could go that kind of introduces you into the Bible that, or at least for me, is a front door, and you may have a different front door. For me, the front door is the Gospel of John. That has a great opening. It's easy to understand. It flows right into the narrative that follows. And so for me, when somebody says, I want to know more about the Bible, where should I start? I say, read the Gospel of John. So for me, that's the front door. Now, maybe you guys have a different front door.
Walter.
But that idea of that. And then what about the living room? What's the living room of the Bible? Where can you share space with others? What's that?
I totally agree that John has some good things to offer. Sometimes I think Jesus is conveyed, like, because it's a later gospel, he's conveyed a little less accessible. Like, he knows who he is, but I do love the chapters like 14, 15, 16, 17, where there's so much compassion. But the Gospel of Mark has the word immediately. It's sort of like, that's its catchphrase, because it like keeps things moving. But right. I do think there's a reason why the Psalms are central to Christian worship, and they are essential in Judaism in other ways, because sometimes I direct people there who think they have to be like really good or always happy before God, because the Psalms are clear. Like, sometimes the Psalms do land on a happy place when they've been in a difficult place, but they are clear with the wide range of feeling and expression that you can have. And
I think that's right. And I think, so for me, the Psalms are like the bedroom, because you wrestle with stuff in the bedroom. You think about things. Sometimes you're happy in the bedroom. Sometimes you're concerned. And there's all that stuff in the Psalms, people that are wretched and there are people that are overjoyed. And so, but the Psalms are definitely a good place to go for that kind of nurturing and comfort, and a sense of introspection that you don't get in a living room. So we see what I'm saying, that there's different ways to think about the Bible and the different parts of the Bible and where to hang out. What about the kitchen? Where do you get nourished in the Bible? And again, you could say that the Psalms would be that, possibly. The Psalms are really good for a whole lot of this. But is there any other part of the Bible that you can think of that feeds you?
Do you like story or narrative? Some of the parables or things from the New Testament. I think the Old Testament is more daunting than the New Testament, in my mind. But maybe some of the parables are, if you like stories.
There are some great stories in the Old Testament, though. I think, which to me always remind me that God calls ordinary people who make lots of mistakes. So I find some of the much more narrative pieces. Like, I love the narrative moments in the Old Testament.
And I was going to say that that's a kind of a living room thing, because you're sort of dealing with other people, and then you're thinking about your own dealings with other people. So it's a social experience that you're going through when you're reading some of these stories. And I think you're absolutely right. There's some great stuff in the Old Testament, especially all of the stuff about from Saul to David to Solomon. That whole sequence, there's a lot of detail, a lot of characters. You've got Absalom and his rebellion and all sorts of other stuff. The generals, Abner and Joab, and there's so much stuff. I think it was Heller wrote a book called God Knows, which is all about his telling of the David story. So yeah, certainly there's some really good things you could seek out if you know where to find them. What about so let's see and for me the kitchen, for me the Sermon on the Mount, there's a lot of meat in that kitchen. So I really like the ideas and images of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, 6, and 7 or whatever it is. And then where in the Bible for you is the attic or the basement, or what do you think that represents as far as the Bible is concerned?
Maybe some of the verses that aren't relevant anymore.
Yeah, right. That's where you stick those genealogies. You put those genealogies in the trunk and you stick them in the back of the attic, right?
I think Revelations, because it's in the attic. It's just, I don't understand it.
Right.
It seems like so out of place with the rest of the.
Yeah.
It's something I wouldn't want to talk about unless I had more knowledge or something.
I will say in my one semester New Testament class in seminary, and I also took New Testament in undergrad, and I took other classes specific. The teacher was like, we don't have enough time to cover Revelation, but we're going to act it out. And that was her attempt. Like, she assigned different small groups, different portions of it to try to get some overarching sense of it. But it's a very different, it's apocalyptic. It's a very different type of literature. So it's hard to use the other skills we learned to apply to that.
Yes,
so
and the writer in me can't resist mentioning, and I know, Carmen, if you looked at it more closely, you'd have seen this. It's singular. It's one revelation, but everybody does that. They call it Revelations because there's all these other things that are plural, like Colossians and Ephesians, and this is, and Lamentations is plural. Everything in there is plural, but this one is not plural. And,
Revelation, it's just something I wouldn't.
It's hard to connect to it, isn't it?
It's hard. So I don't mean that it's bad, but I wouldn't put it like in my living room because it wouldn't be something I would
we can decorate this house of this Bible house that we're using ourselves any way we want to. So what may be in your attic might be different from what might be in Jane's attic or my attic.
But I was saying, because it's good. I don't want it the basement, the attic.
Yeah, okay.
And maybe someday I'll bring it down when I understand it more. But that's very
that happens. I think that does happen, and it happens quite frequently. Well, we're out of time. Thank you for your patience with all. I hope it wasn't too much scripture, but I thought that the scripture kind of rooted us in different ways of seeing domestic space in the Bible, apart from tents. But anyway. But go ahead.
It was interesting.
Good.
Look at it that way, because you had to go through lots and lots and lots of other stuff to get to those little domestic pieces.
Yeah, I kind of knew where most of them were, but then I stumbled across a few more. Phyllis, you may not need to say anything, but if you wanted to, I wanted to give you the chance. I know you're listening.
No, I'm listening and agreeing to several different things, especially Revelations. Definitely, I've tried that several times. And there were other things that were brought up that I have to say, I feel that others must feel the same way. I also think the young people nowadays are just not into believing in anything to do with God. Not all, I'm not saying that, but a lot that I've run into, I can tell they're just not there. Whereas in my life, I always felt a calling, and I still feel it. And so this is why it's very interesting to hear all of you talk. And thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for sharing that. I just wanted a chance to have the black box speak. So I'm glad you did.
Okay.
So we're going to do this every month for November and December, and we haven't decided past that. So the next session will be November the 13th, which will be my father's 95th birthday. He's asleep on the couch at this point. At least I think he is. He's snoring. But anyway, but we'll do that. Probably that one we will do. I'm in Norfolk at the moment, but we'll probably do the next one from Matthews. But thank you all for sharing. You had some great thoughts and ideas, and you know, as always, the session is better because of the sum of its parts. And so thank you for that. I just sort of started going, and you guys take it to a good place. So thank you.
Thank
And-
you.
Thank you.
All right.
Good day.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.